The gates were taller than any she'd seen in her life. Painted silver but dulled by weather and time, they loomed like a promise she couldn't yet understand. Behind them stretched a long driveway framed by towering elms, their branches bending, as if weighed down by the secrets they'd kept for generations. Maria stood at the threshold, clutching a second-hand coat and a canvas bag that had seen better years. The wind whispered through the trees as if warning her, gently tugging at the hem of her skirt. She hesitated for a moment, one deep breath, and stepped forward. The mansion revealed itself slowly, rising like an old story retold. Stone and ivy clung to each other, and wide windows stared out across the world like watching eyes. It wasn't just big, it was quiet to quiet, the kind of silence that feels chosen, the kind that doesn't welcome noise. Inside, her footsteps were swallowed by plush carpets and echoing halls. The smell was faint but distinctive. Old books, wax polish, and something floral that didn't quite mask the passage of time. The staff didn't look at her, not really. Faces turned away as she passed, a nod from the cook, a glance from a housekeeper, the rest shadows in uniform. She had hoped for kindness, or at least direction. Instead, there was only silence. Then came Eleanor. She descended the grand staircase like she had been born on its elegant, sharp, composed. Her heels clicked with the rhythm of control. Her eyes scanned Maria like she was an object being appraised. "You'll be in the East Wing," Eleanor said. "Clean only what you're told. No wandering. Meals are at 6. That was it. No welcome, no name. Just rules." Maria nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She followed the instructions, one hallway after another, until she stood before the nursery door stall and painted white, like a chapel hidden deep inside a cathedral dot. The nursery was beautiful, almost eerily so. Soft creams and golds covered the walls. A hand-painted mural of clouds floated above a carved crib that looked untouched. Toys were placed deliberately, as though for display, not for play. And in the middle of it all, the baby. She was sitting, upright in the crib, wrapped in a delicate blue blanket, not crying, not cooing, just watching. Maria froze. Those eyes dark and wide-held, something she didn't expect from a child so young. Not innocence, not wonder, but awareness. The kind that seems to recognize you before you speak. She approached slowly, setting down her cleaning supplies without taking her eyes off the infant. The baby didn't blink. She just watched. Maria bent to pick up a toy from the floor, a simple stuffed bear, and placed it gently beside the child. As she turned to dust the window ledge, she heard the softest sound, a breath, a shift. She looked back. The baby was still watching, not just watching, locked in. Maria's fingers trembled slightly as she smoothed out the blanket. The baby reached up, not to cry or fuss, but as if to touch her face. The hand lingered in the air. Maria didn't know why, but she felt a strange pull in her chest, a warmth she hadn't expected here. Then, from the doorway, came a quiet voice. "She never looks at anyone like that." Maria turned. It was the old butler, grey at the temples, hands behind his back, eyes distant. He didn't enter the room. He just watched the scene like someone remembering a dream they were once part of. Before Maria could speak, he nodded once, then disappeared into the hallway shadows. She stood in the nursery long after he left. Outside, the trees swayed. A soft rain began tapping the glass. Time seemed to stretch, suspended inside the quiet room, where a child looked up at a stranger with recognition in her eyes. Maria didn't know what it meant, not yet, but something had shifted. And though the house remained cold, and the staff indifferent, the baby looked at her like she belonged. And for the first time in years, Maria felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not fear, not uncertainty, but the distant echo of home. The mansion changed after dark. During the day, its walls stood stiff and hollow, silent, obedient to routine. But when the sun dipped behind the tree line and shadows climbed the staircases, something within the house began to stir. The air grew heavier, the silence deepened, the hallways felt longer. Maria noticed it first in the nursery. Each evening, the nanny would wheel the baby to the window for a few minutes of dusklight, then carefully tuck her into the crib before leaving precisely at 8. Not a minute later, not a moment sooner. She always shut the door behind her with a soft finality, and every night, like clockwork, the crying began. It was soft at first, like the house itself was holding its breath. A whimper, a cough, a broken sob. Then, louder, longer, full-throated cries that echoed down the halls. But strangely, no one responded. Not the staff, not Eleanor, not even the butler the first night. Maria paused outside the nursery with a dustcloth still in her hand, frozen in the quiet terror of hearing a baby cry and knowing she was the only one who noticed. She waited, heart fluttering, expecting someone else to intervene. No one did. By the third night, the cries had become a part of the mansion's rhythm, just another sound among creaking pipes and groaning wood. But for Maria, they were unbearable. She tried to sleep, tried to silence it with a pillow over her head, but the sound pierced through, delicate and desperate. It felt personal, intimate. By the sixth night, she gave in. The halls were dim lit, only by wall sconces with bulbs that hummed faintly. Her slippers padded softly against the floors as she made her way to the nursery. The crying had grown louder, sharp, aching wails that rose and fell like waves. She stood outside the door for a long moment, hand resting on the knob. There was something sacred about that nursery, as though opening it without permission was a kind of trespass, but the cries cut through that hesitation. She turned the handle and stepped inside. Instantly, silence. The room was soaked in moonlight, pale beams falling across the cream-colored walls and soft furnishings. The crib stood untouched, just as it always had, and the baby was smiling, tiny face illuminated by the soft glow, eyes wide, mouth curled upward, not in mischief or sleepiness, but in recognition. Maria's breath caught in her throat. There was no trace of tears, no red eyes, no trembling lips, just the stillness of peace. As if she'd been waiting. Maria stepped forward slowly, unsure of what she was feeling, a blend of confusion, awe, and something older, a longing without words. She knelt beside the crib, resting her hands on the edge. The baby reached out. Her fingers didn't grab or grasp. They hovered, open, soft, seeking. And Maria, without even thinking, leaned closer. She didn't speak, didn't dare. She just sat there, watching the child. And the child watched her back, with a kind of gaze that unsettles and comforts all at once. A gaze that saw more than it should. Minutes passed, unmeasured. Outside, the wind moved the trees, gently, their branches brushing against the windows like fingers on glass. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked, but even that felt far away. There, in the hush of that nursery, the world narrowed into something small and intimate. Maria didn't know what kind of bond was forming. She didn't question why the child stopped crying for her. She only knew that for the first time since arriving, the mansion felt warmer, like something inside. Its walls had recognized her presence. She pulled the blanket gently over the baby's chest and adjusted the soft bear beside her. The baby's smile faded slowly into the stillness of sleep. Maria stood, hesitating at the door before leaving. She looked back, one last time, that crib, the mural above it, the sleeping child, and the quiet. She shut the door gently behind her, holding her breath as if afraid to break the magic that had settled inside. Down the hall, no one stirred. The house had returned to silence. But inside Maria, something had awakened. A thread had been pulled, a connection made. And though she didn't understand it yet, she would return, because in a house full of strangers and silence, something had finally called her home. The east wing of the mansion rarely stirred. Its doors remained closed, its curtains drawn. The air inside felt stale, trapped beneath years of silence and dust. No one spoke of it. No one cleaned it. It existed like an old memory, at a distance, wrapped in quiet shame. But one afternoon, Maria was sent there. The order came without explanation. A passing comment from the head made barely more than a murmur. "You can dust the east wing today. The sun will reach it for an hour." Maria walked through narrow corridors lined with fading wallpaper, her steps echoing against wood that creaked like it hadn't borne weight in years. Each room she entered felt untouched, heavy with the stillness of time. Sunlight poured dimly through tall windows choked by ivy. Dust motes danced in the quiet, and the air carried the scent of old linen and forgotten lives. She moved slowly, wiping surfaces, straightening crooked frames, gently lifting aged porcelain figures to clean beneath them. It felt less like cleaning, and more like listening, each object whispering the faint traces of the people who had once moved through here. At the end of the corridor was a room with no name on its door. Its handle resisted her touch, stiff with age. When it finally gave, the door creaked open to reveal a space unlike the others, almost stripped bare. The floor was warped in places, the wood near the far wall, discolored as if something had once spilled and never dried right. An old chaise sat in the corner, fabric frayed, a blanket still draped over its arm, like someone had only just left. Maria set her dusting cloth down and knelt to pick up a fallen book beside the chaise. As she lifted it, the floor beneath shifted, a slight thud. Hollow, curious, she moved the chair aside and pressed gently against the boards. One gave way. She pried it open with her fingers. Careful, breath held. Beneath, in a shallow cavity, lay a cloth-wrapped bundle tied with fading ribbon. Her hands trembled as she lifted it into the light. It was a photo album, leather-bound, its edges worn and delicate. She untied the ribbon, unfolded the cloth, and opened it. The first pages were ordinary images of the mansion in younger years, garden parties, distant relatives, a younger Eleanor in carefully posed portraits, always watching the camera with that same unblinking gaze. But deeper into the book, something shifted. A photograph of Eleanor holding a baby. The child's hair was dark, eyes wide, skin olive-toned, nothing like Eleanor. There was something unsettling in the way she held the infant, not with warmth, but with rigid formality, like posing with someone else's child. Page after page, more photos followed, some blurred, others sharp. The same baby, months older, growing, looking away from the camera. Then another woman began to appear, not in the center of the photos, but at the edge, almost hidden, caught mid-motion, head turned, hands reaching. Maria leaned closer, the shape of her face, the slope of her nose. It was impossible. It was her, or someone, who looked exactly like her, not in uniform, not a maid, dressed simply, plainly, eyes caught in movement, as though surprised to be seen. Maria's heartbeat slowed, heavy and thick. Her fingertips pressed harder into the pages. She flipped forward. In one photo, the woman sat beside Eleanor on a bench, the baby in her lap. Eleanor smiled stiffly, but the woman's gaze was down-focused only on the child. There was no caption, no date, no explanation. Only the feeling that whatever had happened here had been buried both physically and intentionally. Maria closed the album slowly. The images burned into her mind. She rewrapped it in the cloth, returned it to its hiding place, and replaced the floorboard with quiet care. But something had changed. The silence of the mansion no longer felt hollow, it felt full, thick with the weight of untold stories. And now, Maria carried one of them, a face like hers, a baby that didn't belong to Eleanor, a part of the house's past that someone had tried very hard to forget. She left the east wing in silence, but behind her, dust still floated in the sunlight. The empty room remained, and beneath its floor, the truth waited patiently for her return. The days in the mansion began to blur, stitched together by quiet chores, hollow corridors, and the soft hum of repetition. But for Maria, the rhythm had changed. Something gentle had taken root inside her routine. She found herself drawn to the nursery not out of duty, but from something deeper. Each morning, after dusting frames and folding linens, she would pause at the tall white doors and listen, not for cries this time, but for the laughter, light, bubbling sounds that spilled through the cracks in the wood, like warmth escaping a forgotten place. Inside, the room had softened. The baby had grown more animated, more curious. Her little hands reached for toys, her head turned at sounds. Her laughter, so rare before, became a frequent melody, and always, when Maria entered, those wide eyes would light up. She began to stay longer, fixing the folds in the blankets, rearranging plush animals, sitting silently in the rocker by the window, watching the child nap. There was peace in those moments. Outside, the world remained grey, heavy with rain that came more often now. The mansion, too, kept its distance. Staff moved through it like ghosts, avoiding her eyes, saying little. Eleanor remained absent, behind locked doors or veiled excuses. But within the nursery, something bloomed. Maria began to speak gently to the child, not expecting replies, just sharing fragments of her day. Her voice low, her words unpolished, and sometimes, when the light fell just right and the child responded with a soft coo or giggle, Maria felt known. Then came the evening that changed everything. Rain tapped relentlessly against the nursery windows, like fingers seeking entry. Thunder rumbled far in the distance, soft at first, then louder, rolling through the walls like a memory trying to wake. The lights flickered once. Maria, sat on the floor beside the crib, her legs folded beneath her, one hand gently brushing a lock of hair from the baby's forehead. The child had been giggling earlier, tugging at Maria's sleeve, babbling in soft, meaningless sounds. But now, a stillness, a quiet that felt too full. The baby looked up at her, not in the way most children glance at faces, not with fleeting interest or idle curiosity. No, this gaze was deliberate, reaching through the space between them like a question waiting to be answered, and then swiftly, like the air itself had formed, it came, the word, "Mama," a single breath, a whisper. It hung there, suspended. Maria blinked. The room felt frozen. The thunder paused. Even the rain seemed to hush. She leaned closer, heart pounding in a slow, heavy rhythm she could feel in her throat. The baby looked unbothered, as if unaware of the weight of what she had spoken. Her tiny hand reached upward, fingers curling in the air. Maria's lips parted, but no sound came. Her body stilled, caught between disbelief and something far older, recognition. Her hands trembled. "You heard that, right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible to the room around her, as if asking the walls, the shadows, the silence itself. But there was no reply, only the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows, and the soft, content breath of a child who had just spoken her first word. Maria stood slowly, unsure of how to carry herself. Her heart ached not from pain, but from the sudden rush of something she didn't know she still had the capacity to feel. She paced the room once, ran her hand along the edge of the crib, looked toward the mural on the ceiling, then to the dim hallway beyond the door. "Mama," the word echoed in her chest, circling like a forgotten song. Had anyone else heard? Would anyone believe her if they had? And yet, it didn't matter, because she had heard it, and more than that, felt it. Not as a coincidence, not as a slip of sound, but as a calling. Something had shifted in the space between them, subtle, yet irreversible. The child no longer looked at Maria like a stranger, and Maria could no longer pretend the pull in her chest was just kindness or sympathy. It was something more. She sat back down, placing a gentle hand over the baby's. There were no more words that evening, only silence, wrapped in meaning. And outside, the thunder finally passed. The air that morning felt heavier. The rain had passed, leaving the garden soaked and the windows streaked with silver trails. In the nursery, the silence had returned, but not the same kind that once lingered like dust in forgotten corners. This silence was aware, listening. Maria moved through her duties with quiet hands. She folded fresh sheets, straightened the delicate toys in the nursery, and gently bathed the child with warm water and soft cloth. She was beginning to feel like she belonged, like the mansion, in all its cold and distant weight, had made room for her. But fate, it seemed, never allows warmth to go unnoticed for long. That afternoon, the baby had been unusually joyful. Her small arms reached eagerly for Maria's face, and her eyes followed her every step. As Maria leaned over the crib to adjust a blanket, the baby giggled, clear, bright, unfiltered. Then once again came the word, "Mama," softer than before, but unmistakable. Maria froze, and from the hallway, unseen until it was too late, came the sound of a heel striking tile, sharp, measured, furious. Eleanor. She stepped into the nursery without warning, her eyes narrow, her lips pressed into a line, so thin it looked like it had been carved there. Her gaze moved from the child to Maria and back again, and something shifted in her face. Not surprise, not confusion, but rage, the kind that simmers beneath control. Old and well practiced. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The tension hung in the room like thick fog. Maria stood still, heart pounding, trying to form words she didn't have. But Eleanor only stared, her jaw tight, her eyes cold. And then, just as suddenly, she turned and walked away. The silence that followed felt like thunder. That night, Maria returned to her room to find the door slightly ajar. The smell hit her. First dust, old wood, and something torn. Inside, her things were in disarray. The bed covers had been ripped away. Her clothes, once folded carefully in drawers, now lay scattered across the floor. The only photo she kept creased and faded was missing from her bedside table. A chill crept up her spine. She sank to the floor slowly, gathering what she could, trying to still the shaking in her hands. No one had seen anything. No one asked questions. And by morning, the change had spread. At breakfast, her tray was absent from the kitchen. When she asked, the cook didn't answer. just continued peeling vegetables, eyes averted. The maid she used to greet in the hallway now passed her like a stranger. The butler, once quietly kind, avoided her gaze entirely. There were no accusations, no warnings, only distance, a thick invisible barrier between her and the rest of the household. It wasn't punishment, it was exile. Maria felt it in every quiet glance, every turned back. They looked at her now not with suspicion, but with something colder, contamination, like she had touched something she shouldn't have. The nursery remained the only place untouched. There, the baby welcomed her with the same joy, the same reaching hands, but Maria moved slower now. Her smiles were softer, her heart carried a weight that dulled every moment of light. She couldn't stop hearing that word mama spoken with such innocence, so naturally and yet it had marked her. Outside, the days grew shorter. Shadows arrived earlier in the halls. The light in the mansion dimmed not by weather, but by something deeper. But Maria began to feel watched, not openly, not always, but in the corners of rooms, in the shifting reflections of polished silver. She moved quietly, always aware of eyes that didn't want her seen. She knew Eleanor had heard, knew the child's voice had torn through something sacred, something forbidden, and now the walls were responding. What was once silent indifference had turned to quiet hostility, and still Maria stayed, because when the nursery doors closed behind her, when the world outside dimmed, the baby still smiled, still reached for her, still trusted her presence. In that small golden room, surrounded by soft pastels and flickering light, Maria could forget for just a moment that she no longer had a place in the mansion. Only there, in the warmth of one child's gaze, did she still exist, and for that, she would endure. The hallways of the mansion had always been long and quiet, lined with aging portraits, heavy drapes, and tall windows that let in filtered light but no warmth. But lately, the silence had changed. Now, it came with something else, something soft, breathy, moving just beneath hearing. Whispers. They floated behind her like perfume, never clear enough to follow, but always present. When Maria entered a room, they ceased. When she passed by, they swelled. A kind of hush that wasn't born of politeness, but of fear, of speculation, of old things that had begun to stir. She felt it most in the early hours, just before the sun fully rose, the time when the house was mostly still, when the walls seemed closest to remembering. She would carry linens down the back stairwell and pass two maids in tight conversation, their voices falling into sudden silence as her foot touched the landing. In the dining room, while straightening chairs, she'd catch the tail end of something, names she didn't know, dates she couldn't place, and always that glance, a glance that lingered just a second too long. That week, the staff began to behave differently. They weren't just distant now, they were watching her, measuring her. The young maid who had once lent Maria a scarf in the cold no longer met her eyes. The housekeeper kept her voice clipped and her face unreadable. Even the butler, who had once offered the smallest of kindnesses, stood at attention now like a soldier before a secret. Maria told herself it was nothing, that the mind plays tricks in silence, that people grow colder in winter. But one night, passing near the linen closet, she heard it. Two maids stood with their backs turned, not noticing her shadow. One whispered low, almost conspiratorial, "She looks just like the girl from 12 years ago." The words fell heavy, like stone into still water. Maria froze. The hallway narrowed around her. Time thickened. 12 years ago, a girl. She stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath her weight. The maids, startled, turned, eyes wide. But before she could speak, they were gone, dispersed like smoke, leaving only silence behind. Maria stood, alone, heart thudding. The name hadn't been spoken, but something familiar had been awakened. She couldn't sleep that night. The thought clawed at her in the dark. Who was the girl? Why had they seen her face in Maria's? There were no records, no answers, no one who would meet her questions with anything but silence. The next morning, Maria tried. She cornered one of the housemaids near the laundry room, voice trembling. "Please, tell me what you meant. Who was she?" The maid lowered her eyes. Her hands trembled. She didn't speak, no one did. The house had closed its mouth. Maria returned to her room, shaken. The walls felt closer now, the corridors darker, the ceilings higher, as though built to hold a weight she didn't yet understand. That evening, she ate alone. Her tray was late, the bread cold. She sat near the kitchen door, barely touching her food, when a shadow moved behind her. The cook, older, quiet, always watching. She didn't speak, she didn't look. She simply passed Maria's chair, and, as she did, something brushed her arm. A small object slipped into her palm. Metal. Cool. A key, worn old, wrapped in a folded napkin, as if shielding it from time. Maria looked up, but the cook was gone, already behind the swinging door. No words had been spoken, no instructions, but the meaning was clear. Someone wanted her to look, somewhere. Something was waiting to be opened. Maria held the key tightly in her fist, her pulse racing. It was small, plain, but in that moment, it felt heavier than anything she had ever held. In a house full of silence and secrets, someone had handed her permission, and the whispers in the hallway had just become a path. The key was small, barely the size of her thumb. For days, Maria kept it hidden, wrapped inside a kerchief, and tucked beneath her pillow, like a secret too sacred to expose to daylight. But it burned quietly in her thoughts, calling to her in silent whispers. The mansion had many doors, some grand and carved, others forgotten and sealed by time. But only one matched the feeling that stirred inside her chest. At the end of the north hallway, past a row of cracked picture frames, and beneath a dust-covered chandelier, there stood a narrow wooden door. Most walked past it without a glance, as though it had ceased to exist. Maria had never seen anyone enter, but something in its stillness, its refusal to be noticed, pulled at her. That night, long after the nursery had gone still and the halls were bathed in shadows, she returned to it. The key turned with an almost imperceptible click. The door opened slowly, groaning against the frame. Cold air spilled out like forgotten breath. A narrow staircase spiraled upward, steep and silent, vanishing into darkness. Maria climbed. At each step creaked beneath her weight. Dust clung to the walls like skin. The air was thick with age, faintly metallic, faintly sweet, as if time had been sealed here. At the top, the attic, she stepped into a vast, low-ceilinged space, lit only by the moonlight slipping through a cracked skylight. It stretched far beyond what she imagined. Old trunks sat in crooked stacks, broken furniture leaned against the walls, faded curtains draped across crates, and scattered papers lined the floor like fallen leaves. Everything smelled of silence. This was not storage. This was memory. She moved slowly, trailing her fingers along dust-laced surfaces. A child's wooden rocking horse sat forgotten near the wall, its paint chipped, its eyes hollow. Portraits leaned backward on shelves, too heavy for their frames. A woman's hat, still holding the shape of its owner's head, lay atop a cracked vanity mirror, and there beneath a yellowed lace cloth. Maria found the box, small, wooden, carved with initials she didn't recognize. Inside, papers faintly wrinkled, still smelling of ink. She unfolded the top sheet with trembling hands. A birth certificate. Her name was there. First name, Maria, but the surname was wrong. Not the one she carried now. Something else, something unfamiliar. Her breath caught. Below it, more documents, one folded twice. Tucked beneath the certificate was a medical record, faded ink, date of birth, and then a hospital bracelet. The plastic was brittle with age, but the ink remained clear. Baby A, just those two words. Maria stared at it for a long time. Baby A. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was more than she had ever had. The room around her seemed to lean in, waiting. She pressed the bracelet against her palm, her eyes burning. The girl from 12 years ago. The whispers, the baby who called her mama, new surname, a hidden attic. Was it all coincidence, or a carefully buried truth? She looked down at the certificate again. Her fingers brushed the paper's edge. Her heart felt like it had shifted, like it no longer lived entirely in her chest, but part of it had scattered across time, settling inside the dust and wood and silence of that attic. She stayed there, for what felt like hours. The mansion creaked above and below, its bones shifting with the night. Outside, the moon moved behind a cloud. The attic dimmed. Maria stood, holding the box to her chest. She descended the stairs slowly, the key still warm in her pocket. Behind her, the door clicked shut, its secrets briefly revealed, but far from finished. The attic had not left her, even after returning to her room, after tucking the box beneath her bed and washing the dust from her hands. Its presence lingered like cobwebs in her thoughts, trailing behind every blink. That night, the mansion was quieter than usual. No wind, No thunder, not even the usual groan of wood. Settling into sleep, Maria moved slowly through the hallway, carrying only a single candle. Her steps were silent on the cold stone. She wasn't sure why her feet led her there, only that she couldn't rest. She passed the nursery, paused briefly. The baby was asleep, her breath barely a whisper. Then she turned left, toward the small dressing room Eleanor rarely used. There was a mirror there, old, tall, with a frame of carved roses and faded gold. It stood on 3 legs, slightly crooked, angled toward the window. By day, it reflected light from the garden, but now, in the hush of night, it reflected only shadows. Maria stepped in front of it. The candle flame fluttered in the glass, then steadied. Her reflection looked back older than she remembered. Pale, soft eyes, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile without pain. She reached into her apron and pulled out the photograph she had taken from the attic box. A single image, faded in Christophe, a baby wrapped in white cloth, staring somewhere just beyond the frame. She held it beside her face and waited. At first, it seemed like nothing more than longing, but then, the shape of the eyes, the subtle slope of the cheek, the same furrow between the brows when thinking. It was there. Undeniable, not imagined, not hoped, seen. The baby in the photo, the one labeled Baby A, was hers, and somehow, impossibly, the child in the nursery looked the same. Maria stared at her reflection. Slowly, a pressure bloomed in her chest, hot and hollow. A tremor moved through her hands. She placed the photo on the small vanity table and sat before the mirror. Her mind began to reach backward, toward things she had long stopped questioning. Why? Her earliest memories began with loss. Why fire haunted her sleep. Why her childhood felt like fragments, pieces of a story someone else had lived. The mirror offered no comfort, only truth. It was there, in the shape of her nose, in the arch of her brow, that the past began to come forward. A house, a scream, heat. The feeling of being pulled, carried, voices shouting, then darkness, and years later, the mansion, a job, a baby. Eyes that looked at her as if remembering something Maria had forgotten. She whispered her own name, quietly. It felt different now, like a question. The image of the child in the crib flickered through her mind again, so small, so bright in the dimness. Mama. That single word had been the first crack, and now the whole world was tilting. Maria reached for the hospital bracelet again. Baby A. She held it beside the mirror, watching it reflect back like a relic from someone else's life. Yet it was hers, not a piece of evidence, but a piece of herself, lost, buried, returned. The mirror didn't lie. The girl from 12 years ago, the resemblance, the coldness in Eleanor's stare, the attic-y. It was all pointing to one truth, not just that Maria belonged here, but that someone had tried to make sure she didn't. She exhaled slowly. The flame of the candle trembled again, casting shadows across the mirrored surface, and in that flickering light, Maria saw herself anew, not as the maid, not as the outsider, but as someone wronged, someone erased, someone remembered by a child, by whispers, by the reflection of a life stolen and waiting to be reclaimed. She stood. Behind her, the candlelight stretched across the floor like a path. Ahead of her, questions waited, but now, finally, so did the strength to ask them. The night began like all others, blanketed in silence, soaked in shadows. The mansion hushed under the weight of its own secrets. But inside Maria, something had changed. All day, the truth had sat like a stone in her chest. The mirror, the bracelet, the photograph, it was too much to unsee. Each quiet corner of the house now felt sharper, as if watching her. The walls no longer held mystery, but memory, her memory. And so, when the clock in the corridor struck midnight, Maria made her decision. She would leave, not for lack of courage, not even for fear, but because the pain of staying had grown too large to hold. Her room was small. There wasn't much to pack. A wool shawl, a comb, the box from the attic now clutched tightly in her arms. She didn't light a candle. She moved by moonlight, gathering the pieces of herself in silence. The house moaned faintly, old wood shifting beneath the weight of something it didn't want to let go. Her footsteps were slow but certain, down the narrow servants' hallway, past the staircase where she'd first seen the baby's eyes, past the linen closet where whispers once lived. The front entrance waited ahead, tall, arched, and carved in silence. She reached for the doorknob, but before her fingers touched the brass, a sound broke through the stillness, a cry, faint at first, then louder, then a scream. Raw, piercing, shattering. The mansion's breathless quiet. It came from the nursery. Maria froze. She had heard the baby cry before, but never like this. This wasn't hunger. It wasn't restlessness. It was terror. The scream climbed in pitch, desperate, wild, as if something had been taken. Her heart beat once, then again, and then she was moving. Back down the hall, up the stairs, past the portraits and cracked frames. She dropped the box. The shawl fell from her shoulder. Her breath came hard, fast, uneven. When she reached the nursery, the door was slightly ajar, swaying in rhythm with the wail. Inside, the crib was trembling. The baby's tiny hands reached skyward, grasping at the air as if begging to be held by someone who wasn't there. Maria crossed the room in seconds. She lifted the baby into her arms, held her close, rocked her against her chest, and slowly the cries softened, until there was only a whimper, then breath, then stillness. Maria stood in the center of the room, the baby pressed to her heart, and for a moment, the house exhaled, as if relieved. The wind outside quieted, the chandelier stilled, even the ticking of the old nursery clock seemed too slow. She held the child close, eyes shut tight. "I'm not leaving you," she whispered. Not to the house, not to Eleanor, not to the silence that had tried to bury everything. She sank into the rocking chair by the window. The baby's breath was warm against her collarbone. Outside, the stars blinked through drifting clouds. Somewhere deep in the walls, pipes groaned, softly, like distant voices coming to peace. But Maria didn't move for a long time. She simply rocked. Back and forth, the warmth of the baby in her arms, the weight of the night behind her, the echo of everything she'd nearly walked away from now, cradled safely in her hands. She had come to the mansion, a stranger, a maid. Disposable, unseen. But now she was something else, not because of what she'd uncovered, but because of what she refused to abandon. She looked down at the child, the same dark eyes, the same knowing stare. They had both been forgotten once, but not anymore, and not by each other. Dawn came softly, not with golden light or warmth, but with a dull grey hush that settled over the mansion like a blanket of secrets. Maria hadn't moved from the nursery chair. She sat still, the baby curled against her chest, breathing in sync with the quiet rise and fall of her heart. Somewhere below, the house began to stir. Faint sounds, bare feet on stone, a kettle boiling, the rustle of linen whispered of another day beginning, as if nothing had changed, as if the night hadn't cracked something open that could never be sealed again. But Maria was no longer listening to the house. She was listening inward. The baby's warmth had anchored her. Her tears had dried into the fabric of Maria's blouse. Her little fingers still clutched the edge of the cloth. Maria hadn't planned what came next. She didn't need to. The moment was enough. Until the door creaked. Soft, measured. She didn't look up at first, but then the footsteps came, slow, deliberate, and with them, the familiar scent of cologne and old wood. The butler. He stood in the doorway for a long time, not saying a word. The light behind him carved his silhouette from the darkness like a memory returning. Then without invitation or hesitation, he stepped inside and walked toward her. Maria watched him through tired eyes. She expected scolding or silence, but instead, he sat right beside her, not too close, not formal, just quietly there. The air between them held something unspeakable, something older than either of them could name. For a long moment, there were no words, only the soft creaking of the rocking chair. Then, in a voice worn thin by time, he spoke. "She's not Eleanor's." Maria's breath caught. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on the crib, now empty. "You were never meant to return here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. It was not anger, not warning. It was grief. Old grief. Grief that had waited 12 years to be spoken aloud. Maria clutched the baby closer. The butler reached into his coat with trembling fingers and pulled something small from his breast pocket. A locket, delicate, silver, etched with a faded pattern that once might have gleamed in the sun. He opened it gently, like unfolding a memory he had held for too long. Inside, a photo. The baby, not just any baby, hers. The same face, the same wide, wondering eyes. He placed the locket in Maria's hand without a word. The metal was warm from his skin, but it burned cold in her palm. She stared at it, then back at him. His eyes shimmered with something restrained, guilt, sorrow, maybe even relief. "You don't remember everything," he said softly. "You weren't supposed to." Maria felt the room tilt again. "What happened?" she whispered. The butler's eyes dropped. "There was a fire," he said. "A terrible one, and a deal made after." He didn't say Eleanor's name. He didn't need to. His voice trembled now. "I should have stopped it, but I was told it was better this way." The locket in Maria's hand felt heavier by the second. "You were meant to forget, to disappear, and to be raised as someone else's." Maria's fingers closed around the locket. A truth had been laid bare. Her truth. All this time, she had been the ghost haunting her own story. Now, the pieces fit. The fire, the whispers, the baby's voice, the staff's fear. And now, the butler's quiet, broken but whole. He stood then, slowly, his back a little more hunched than before. "I've kept that locket for 12 years, he said, waiting for someone brave enough to claim it. Then he left, no more words, no absolution, just a closing door, and a silence that felt softer than before. Maria looked down at the baby in her arms, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt seen, known, and finally, home. The sun hung low that evening, caught in the branches of the bare trees that lined the outer gardens. The house had grown strangely quiet again, not in its usual brooding way, but in the stillness that follows after a confession. Maria moved slowly through the stone path behind the mansion, her hands still faintly trembling from the locket's weight in her coat pocket. It was the butler who had gestured toward the back, not with words, just with a quiet nod, his eyes full of something old and unsaid. The garden beyond the main lawn was nearly forgotten, overgrown, hidden by ivy-covered gates and rose bushes that hadn't bloomed in years. The path was fractured and mossy, nearly swallowed by weeds. Branches creaked above her, bare and twisted. The air smelled of damp soil and something faintly metallic. Maria stepped carefully, past fallen leaves and cracked stone angels. Then she saw them, 3 small headstones, nestled beneath a crooked elm tree, softly leaning, as if bowed in prayer. They were simple, weather-worn, and covered in a thin veil of moss. She bent to brush one clean, her fingers gentle, as if disturbing them would wake something sacred. The names were faint. The first, Amelia; the second, Joseph; and the third no name at all, just a date. 3 small lives, carved into stone. A chill ran through her. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. She didn't turn round. She knew it was him. The butler's voice was rough with memory. Only one survived. He said Maria remained still, but Eleanor, she couldn't let go of the others. His words were brittle, and behind them, something darker stirred. She buried them herself. He continued, told the staff they were to be forgotten, said grief was a private thing, but it consumed her. Maria placed her palm gently on the unnamed stone. No name, no identity, just a life that had barely begun. She took the last child as her own, he said, now barely audible, as if to undo what had happened, as if she could erase the past by rewriting the future. Maria's eyes burned, but no tears fell. She felt the wind brush her cheek like the memory of a hand, and suddenly, the house made sense. The silence, the strict rules, the loneliness tucked inside every hallway. It wasn't cruelty, it was grief, unprocessed, unforgiven. The garden had held the truth all along, buried beneath vines and silence. She stood slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. 3 small graves, and 1 living child. The weight of it all hung in the branches above, swaying gently with the breeze. Maria turned to face the butler. He looked older in this light, smaller, as though time had finally caught up to him. "She was never meant to be yours," he said softly, "but she chose you." Maria looked down at the stones once more. Maybe it wasn't fate. Maybe it wasn't even justice. Maybe it was simply love, unexplained, unplanned, but real. She took one last breath in the garden, the scent of earth and time pressing deep into her lungs. Then she turned back toward the house. The mansion loomed in the distance, its tall windows catching the last light of day. But now, it didn't look quite so hollowed now. It looked like a place where ghosts could rest, and where truth, no matter how painful, had finally been spoken aloud. It began with rain, soft, rhythmic taps against the nursery window, like knuckles from a world that hadn't spoken in years. Maria sat still, holding the child close as the room dimmed with stormlight. The sky outside had darkened, turning a steel grey that whispered of something long buried beneath the surface. And in the hush that followed, memory began to rise quietly, and then, all at once, it came in fragments. The scent of smoke, the heat of flames licking at a doorway, a hallway glowing red, not from light but from fire, screams in the dark, her own voice crying out, the sound of glass breaking, her child wrapped in white cloth, pressed tight against her chest, running, breathing hard, feet stumbling through ash and sirens, and then hands, not hers, tearing the child from her grasp, a scream that didn't come from her throat, but from her soul. Maria gasped. Her arms clutched the baby tighter now. She could feel it. She was back there, in that fire, in that moment that had divided her life in two. The wind outside surged, and thunder cracked. Open the silence. The storm had begun. She rose from the chair slowly, as if wading through water. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, seeing both the nursery and a memory that had once been stripped away, 12 years ago. The fire. She hadn't escaped it, untouched. Someone had made sure she forgot. A forced adoption, they called it, in whispers. A disappearance no one questioned. A baby reassigned to a mother who could not accept death. Maria pressed her forehead to the nursery window. Rain blurred the glass, the trees beyond swaying in the storm like grieving women. Her breath left a fog. Against the pane, in it, she saw her reflection. But this time, she didn't flinch. Because now, she remembered not only the pain, but the love, the fierce, endless love of a mother who had once fought through fire to protect her child, and had lost, but not forever. She turned back toward the crib. Though the baby no longer slept there, she was nestled in the crook of Maria's arm, content in the quiet heartbeat of someone she never stopped waiting for. The storm outside howled, but inside, everything was still. Maria lowered herself to the floor beside the rocking chair, the baby tucked against her chest, and she wept. Not the bitter tears of confusion, but the deep, silent tears of remembering, of recovering what was taken. She thought of Eleanor, of the grief that had twisted her into someone else, of the butler carrying secrets like stones in his coat, of the headstones in the garden, leaning in the cold, and of herself, of the girl she used to be, the girl who ran through fire, the girl who screamed at shadows, the girl who never stopped searching, even when she forgot what she was looking for. The storm raged on. Lightning lit the nursery in flashes, revealing every corner like old film frame by frame, as if the house itself was remembering too. She wasn't afraid of the thunder now, because the real storm had already passed. It had passed 12 years ago, when love was ripped apart by fire, when truth was buried beneath grief, when a child's name was changed and a mother was erased. But she had survived, and so had the child. Maria looked down at her daughter. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fist curling against Maria's blouse, and Maria smiled through tears, the kind of smile that only comes when something broken begins to mend. The storm outside began to soften, its fury spent. Rain still fell, but now it whispered instead. Off screamed. The room returned to quiet. Maria stood again, rocking slowly, no longer lost, no longer searching, but found, and finally, whole. The storm had passed. But inside the mansion, something far darker was gathering. Maria stood in the long hallway, the baby resting quietly in her arms. Her footsteps echoed faintly on the wooden floor, each one bringing her closer to the truth that had lived behind every cold glance, every silence, every locked door. She didn't tremble with fear, not anymore, but something inside her shook deep, invisible like the cracking of frozen ground just before it breaks open. At the far end of the corridor, the study door stood ajar. Light flickered from inside, warm and golden, but wrong. It pulsed too brightly, like the heartbeat of someone unraveling. Maria stepped inside. Eleanor sat in her chair by the fireplace, not reading, not writing, just waiting. Her hands were clasped tight in her lap, her posture stiff, poised like a statue carved from bitterness and denial. She didn't look at Maria right away, only at the fire. The room smelled of burning wood and perfume, and something else, something sharp, like the edge of something broken. Maria stood still. For a moment, there was only the quiet pop of the fire. Then Eleanor turned, her face once composed, refined, cold was twisted now with something wild. Her eyes burned, not with hatred, but with something worse, delusion. She's mine now, Eleanor whispered. Her voice was soft, Melodically, a lullaby cracked in half. Maria's fingers tightened protectively around the baby. "I gave her everything you couldn't," Eleanor said. And then she laughed. A small sound at first, but it grew. Sharp, high, hollow. Not joy, not cruelty, but madness. The kind of laughter that came from someone who had loved too wrongly and lost too completely. Maria stepped forward, one foot barely making a sound. "You stole her," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, but it trembled with something ancient. Eleanor rose slowly, not like a woman, but like a shadow standing upright. "You left her," she hissed. "There was fire, yes, and confusion. And I was there. I saved her. I kept her safe. I gave her my name, my life." Maria shook her head. "No," she said. "You took her." The baby stirred in her arms, letting out the smallest sigh as if sensing the storm. In the room, Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the child. Her voice softened again. "She called me Mama first. Did you know that?" Maria said nothing, because she didn't need to. Everything Eleanor had built, every lie, every false lullaby, every carefully maintained illusion was crumbling around her, and she knew it. "You don't understand," Eleanor said now, stepping closer. "I lost three." Her fingers trembled at her sides. Her lips quivered. There were tears, now real ones, maybe, but they came too late. Maria held the baby tighter. "She's not yours," she said again, but not cruelly, soft, final, something. Inside, Eleanor broke then, visibly. Her knees weakened. Her hands clawed at the back of the velvet chair to steady herself. Her gaze darted between the fire and the child, as if unsure which one to fall into. "She needed love," Eleanor whispered. "She needed a mother." Maria stepped closer, her eyes softening not with pity, but understanding. "She had won," she said. "She always did." Eleanor sank slowly into the chair. Her body seemed smaller now, her voice a whisper. "I just wanted one to stay." The fire crackled beside them. Shadows danced across the walls. Maria stood for a long time, watching the woman who had once seemed so powerful, so unreachable, now curled inward, wrapped in the very grief that had stolen everything from both of them. No more words were spoken. Maria turned. She walked out of the study with the baby in her arms, and this time no one stopped. The rain returned, soft at first, then steadier, as if the sky was preparing to mourn. Something it could not stop. Maria stood at the edge of her small room. The lamp turned low, shadows flickering across the floor. The baby lay wrapped in a shawl, breathing quietly, unaware of the weight the night carried. There were no more questions now, no more confusion, only a choice, and Maria had made hers. She would leave, not in defiance, not in fear, but in love. In the hallway, the butler waited, his coat already on, his hands shaking ever so slightly as he handed Maria a small canvas bag. Inside it, a few coins, a folded map, a train ticket with no return. No words passed between them, only a glance, a silent understanding. Tonight, the storm would hide their footprints. Tonight, the house would not watch them go. Together, they moved, slowly, carefully, like ghosts drifting through memory. The hallways stretched longer than usual. The silence between each creak and whisper stretched taut like string pulled tight. Every sound felt louder. The ticking of the grandfather clock, the sigh of a window pane, the distant thunder outside, shaking loose dust from the ceiling. Down the servants' passageway they crept, Maria with the child pressed close, the butler leading with measured steps. The kitchen was dark, cold, its hearth long extinguished. They slipped through it like smoke, but then a floorboard, just one. It gave beneath Maria's foot with a hollow groan, a sound that shouldn't have belonged to the night. They froze. The butler turned his head slowly, listening. Nothing. No footsteps above. No voice calling out. But the house. The house had noticed. It always did. Maria's breath came short. The baby shifted, murmured, and nestled back into her warmth. They moved again, past the back pantry, through the narrow hall where old coats hung lifeless on rusted hooks. At the far end of the corridor, the service door stood locked, but the butler slid the key from his pocket and turned it, slow and deliberate. The lock clicked, the door creaked, and then cold air, rain. Freedom. They stepped out into the night. The storm swept around them, the wind folding their coats tight to their skin. The baby stirred again, her cheek brushing Maria's collarbone. Maria didn't stop. She couldn't. The gravel path behind the greenhouse was slippery. each stone a test of balance and will, but she held steady. The butler moved beside her like a shadow, guiding them through the veil of trees that bordered the property's edge. Beyond them the train tracks, and beyond that, a life untouched by fire, by false mothers, by haunted hallways, a place where names were not stolen, and silence didn't scream. Maria looked back once. The mansion loomed behind them, barely visible through the mist and branches. Its windows glowed faintly, watching, but this time she didn't flinch. She didn't wonder what would become of Eleanor, or the echoes inside that house. That story was over. This was the beginning of another. She pulled the baby closer. The child's warmth fought against the storm, her breath soft, her future unwritten. And Maria walked on step by step, into the night, into herself. The storm had deepened. Thunder rolled like a warning across the black sky, and the rain poured, harder now, slashing through the trees, soaking the earth, turning the garden paths into rivers of mud and memory. Maria's breath came in short bursts, fogging the night. She held the baby tighter against her chest, shielding her with the folds of her coat. The butler was just steps ahead, guiding her through the hedges and dripping branches of the overgrown back lawn. His steps were heavy, precise, deliberate. Every one of them mattered. But then a sound, sharp, furious, a door slamming open against the wind. A voice, raw, feral, unhinged, cut through the storm. "She's gone, Eleanor." The word carried like a shattering mirror across the grounds. And then, footsteps, fast, reckless, coming closer. The butler turned sharply, his face pale in the lightning's flash. "Keep going," he whispered, though the wind carried the words away. Maria didn't need to be told twice. She turned and ran, through the garden, past the ivy-covered statues, down the crooked gravel path that led to the back gate. Branches whipped at her face, thorns tore at her skirt, mud pulled at her shoes, and still she ran. The baby stirred, but didn't cry. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps something deep in her bones recognized the rhythm of her mother's heart, pulsing wild with fear and love. Behind them, Eleanor's footsteps grew louder, the slap of her heels against whetstone, the chaos of her breath, the panic of a woman losing the last lie she had left to hold on to. Maria reached the rose archway, nearly invisible in the storm. Just beyond it's the final stretch, the old iron gates. Freedom. And then a scream. "You don't get to take her." The voice was jagged, cracking through the thunder like a knife. Maria didn't turn. She couldn't. But she could hear Eleanor crashing through the bushes, slipping, falling, clawing her way forward. "She's mine," Eleanor shrieked. "She called me Mama." Lightning lit the sky again, bleaching the world in white. In that instant, Maria saw the gate stall, rusted, slightly ajar. The butler was already there, pushing one side open with both hands, his eyes locked with Maria's. Just a few more steps, but Eleanor was close now, close enough to see her wild eyes, close enough to hear her sobbing, close enough to feel her fury. "Give her back." Maria stumbled. Her foot slid in the mud, her knee hit the ground, but her arms never let go. The baby whimpered once, then fell silent. Maria rose again, gritted her teeth, and moved. Rain soaked her hair, her dress, her skin, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the tiny warmth in her arms, the pulse of a child who had waited so long to come home. Eleanor's hands reached forward, grasping at the air, but she was too late. Maria passed through the gate. The butler pulled it shut behind them with a deep metallic clang. Eleanor slammed against the other side, fists pounding the bars. "I raised her," she cried. "I loved her." Maria turned then, not in hatred but in sorrow. She met Eleanor's gaze through the bars, two women standing on either side of truth. "She was never yours," Maria said, her voice barely louder than the rain. Eleanor sank to her knees in the mud, sobbing now, shaking. The storm thundered one final time, and then began to fade. Maria turned away. She walked down the path beyond the gate, the butler just behind her. No one looked back again, because that story, the one built on fire, lies, and stolen names, was over, and ahead, through the mist and storm, a new story waited to be written. Dawn arrived with no warmth. The storm had broken overnight, but the sky remained heavy, muted in color, low with clouds. Rain still fell, though softer now, like a whisper that refused to be silenced. Maria stood at the edge of the gravel road, cradling her child beneath a worn shawl. The wind tugged gently at her hair. The scent of damp earth filled the air, and, in the near distance, the faint wail of sirens began to echo through the trees. She didn't flinch. This moment had been coming for years, even if she hadn't known it. Beside her, the butler waited silently, his old hands wrapped tight around the cane he rarely needed. His eyes stayed on the road, blinking only when the flashing red and blue lights broke through the mist. The cars came fast, 3 of them, crunching to a stop against the wet stone. Doors opened. Uniforms spilled out. For a brief moment, Maria felt the wind freeze, like the entire world was holding its breath. And then Eleanor's voice pierced the morning, a scream that high, shrill, unraveling. She had followed somehow. In the madness of the night, she had reached the gate, again rain-soaked. Mud splattered her gown, torn at the hem, clinging to her frame like the last remnants of a life she could no longer control. She stumbled forward, hair wild, eyes wide with desperation. No, she's mine. 2 officers intercepted her, firm but careful, hands outstretched. But Eleanor wasn't done. She thrashed in their grasp, sobbing, shouting, laughing all at once. Words poured from her in a broken flood, memories, accusations, pleas, fragments of a life that had unraveled long before this day. She needed me, she cried. You don't understand. She called me Mama. Maria stood frozen, not from fear, from something deeper, released. That Eleanor dropped to her knees, held firmly by the officers. Maria's legs almost buckled, but she stayed standing, holding her daughter closer, burying her face gently in the child's soft hair. She didn't need to speak, not anymore. The truth had already risen, and the weight that had lived beneath her ribs for over a decade was gone. She looked down at her child. The baby looked back with calm eyes, unafraid of the sirens, the rain, or the voices that cracked the air around them. There was no fear here, only clarity. The butler stepped forward, speaking in quiet tones to one of the officers. Papers were exchanged, documents, timelines, photos. Proof. The child was Maria's, had always been, and now, finally, the world would recognize it. Screams softened, folding inward into sobs that rocked her body in slow, pitiful waves. She was no longer a villain in this story. She was simply a woman who had been broken by grief, and had chosen to bind others in her shatter. The police lifted her gently, escorting her toward the back seat of the cruiser. She didn't resist now. Her eyes were empty, distant, like someone who had wandered too far into the past to find her way home. Maria didn't watch her leave. Instead, she looked toward the horizon. The rain had slowed to a mist. The trees shimmered with moisture, and, somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, soft and solitary. One of the officers approached Maria with care. She nodded, answering his quiet questions with calm resolve. Her hand never left the baby's back. They took her name, her story, the truth, and this time, no one doubted it. No one looked at her like a maid. No one ignored her voice. They saw a mother, a survivor, and a child whose life was no longer a secret. As the last police car pulled away, tires hissing over the wet gravel, Maria remained where she stood, bathed in mourning, light that barely touched the earth. The silence that followed was unlike the mansion's cold hush. This silence felt clean, like a page turned, like breath after drowning. Maria let out a long exhale, not from exhaustion, but from peace. And for the first time in 12 long years, she smiled. The city breathed differently. Gone were the long echoing corridors and locked doors of the mansion. Now there was the distant hum of traffic, the quiet rhythm of footsteps in the stairwell, and the soft creak of worn wooden floors that told no secrets, just stories of ordinary days. Maria stood in the doorway of their new apartment, holding her daughter close, a single key pressed into her palm. The room was small, just one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, faded wallpaper that peeled gently at the corners, but it was theirs. No maids, no butlers, no watchers from behind curtained windows. Just sunlight spilling in through a dusty window, catching in her daughter's eyelashes as she looked around wide-eyed at the space that would become home. The first few nights were quiet. It almost felt unfamiliar, but not in the cold way. Silence once wrapped around her. This silence was kind, patient. It gave them room to breathe. Maria slept with the baby tucked beside her on a thin mattress laid out on the floor. No crib yet, no furniture really, just boxes, hand-me-downs, and a locket she kept close. Inside it her daughter's picture, and a reminder of everything they had survived. In the mornings, Maria opened the windows, let the breeze sweep away the ghosts. She began painting the nursery with her own hands. She had no experience, no plan, just soft shades of lavender and white, gentle brushstrokes across bare walls, a little more each day. Some days the paint dripped down her wrist, staining her skin. She didn't mind. There was something healing in the mess. Her daughter laughed. Often now, real laughter, sweet, unafraid. She crawled across the floor with delight, pulling at Maria's sleeve, watching the world with wonder instead of worry. Maria began to laugh too, sometimes softly, sometimes through tears. They cooked together simple meals, with ingredients she could afford. Maria would hum old lullabies under her breath, while stirring rice or slicing apples, and her daughter would tap her little hands against the high-care tray, smiling. Every hug felt like a stitch, every kiss a thread pulling torn fabric back together. They were rebuilding, not from brick or plaster, but from warmth, from presence, from days that didn't hurt. Maria found work at a nearby bakery. The hours were long, but the pay was steady. The scent of flour and sugar clung to her hair each evening as she returned home, exhausted but full of something she hadn't known in years. Hope. On weekends they walked to the park. The first time her daughter touched grass, she froze tiny fingers brushing over the blades, unsure if it would vanish like so much else had. But a didn single quote, it stayed. And so did they. Maria watched her daughter grow stronger each day, her voice forming new words, her eyes bright with trust. No one called her the wrong name now. No one claimed what wasn't theirs. The locket remained beside the bed, not as a reminder of sorrow but of how far they'd come. The nursery was nearly finished. One wall held simple watercolor animals, another was painted in clouds and stars, and above the crib, in soft, careful strokes, Maria had written one word, a name. Her name. Returned. Owned. Whole. In the quiet of the evening, after the stories had been read and the lullabies had faded, Maria would sit near the crib, watching her daughter sleep. The city still whispered. Outside, life still rushed beyond their walls. But here, in this little room, time softened. And in its gentleness, a truth grew clearer. They had lost much, but what they had found was stronger. Maria pressed a kiss to her daughter's forehead and whispered what she had waited 12 long years to say, without fear, without interruption. You're safe now. And in the hush that followed, the nursery breathed with warmth, with belonging, with the quiet echo of love finally given a place to live. The sky outside was a dark velvet, stitched with stars that blinked faintly through the open window. The city had quieted, just the occasional hum of a distant car, the rustle of leaves brushing the sill, the slow breath of a world finally at rest. Inside their little apartment, everything was still. The nursery glowed in a warm amber light, soft and gentle shadows on the walls Maria had painted with her own hands. Clouds floated above a crib. Tiny animal shapes danced across the corners, and tucked beneath a quilt of lavender and ivory was a child who now slept without fear. Maria sat nearby, her back against the edge of the bed, a worn storybook still open in her lap. The pages fluttered quietly in the breeze. She should have moved, turned off the light, stood up. But some moments ask you to pause. Some moments ask you to feel everything, deeply, fully before they pass. And this was one of them. The quiet was broken by a gentle rustle. Tiny footsteps padded across the wooden floor. Maria turned her head, and there she was, her daughter, hair tousled from sleep, cheeks warm and pink, eyes wide and curious in the half-light. She didn't speak right away. She climbed into Maria's lap, small arms wrapping around her neck. The child rested her head against her mother's chest, as if listening for something she already knew by heart, the heartbeat that had once been her lullaby. And then, in the softest voice, fragile and certain, she asked, "You're my real mummy, right?" The world slowed. Maria didn't rush to answer. She didn't need to. She cradled her daughter gently, kissed her forehead, and held her closer than words could carry. And then, with a voice that trembled not from pain, but from release, she whispered, "Always have been." There were no echoes in this room, no doubt, no shadows left behind the doors, just a truth spoken aloud finally, spoken not as a defense, not as a plea, but as something as natural as the wind through the window, as sacred as a name returned. The little girl smiled, content, her eyes fluttered shut as she nestled deeper into her mother's warmth, and in that stillness, Maria felt it, something shift, something settle. The ache she had carried for 12 long years, the hole torn open by fire and silence and lies, was no longer empty. It had been filled, not with answers, not with apologies, but with love, real, unshaken, unconditional. She looked down at the child in her arms, the daughter she had once lost, and then found, not in courtrooms or papers or confrontations, but in moments like this, in lullabies, in laughter, in the soft way she reached out at night, just to make sure her mother was still near. This was motherhood, not defined by possession, but by presence. By the thousand small things that stitched two hearts together, one thread at a time. The room had grown cooler. Maria pulled the blanket up around them both. The walls around them no longer felt like shelter from a storm, but part of a home, a beginning. The locket rested on the nightstand, glinting in the moonlight. It held no magic, no curse, just memory. And now, Maria didn't need to open it to remember, because everything that mattered was right here, breathing softly in her arms. As sleep returned, Maria laid her head back against the wall, eyelids heavy, heart full. The wind outside danced with the curtains, and the world, for once, felt whole again.